The cabin groaned, a dying thing under the weight of winter. Snow, thick and unyielding, pressed against its walls, mounting high against the single, small window that offered only a square of pale, frosted gray. Alara shivered, not just from the biting cold that seeped through every chink in the rough-hewn logs, but from a deeper chill that had settled into her bones since Thomas had stopped breathing 3 weeks ago. His empty side of the bed, a cold, vast chasm, was a constant reminder of her solitude. The last of the dried venison hung skeletal in the larder, a grim count of the days she had left. Outside, the world was a canvas of white, indifferent and deadly. The wind, a mournful banshee, keened through the eaves, carrying with it the ghostly echoes of the town's final pronouncements. If you take off the mask, we won't look at you. Not a literal mask, then, not yet, but the one she wore of polite composure, of quiet resilience, even as their pity, laced with judgment, had hardened around her like a shell. Now, with Thomas gone, that shell felt fragile, on the verge of shattering. She had worn a simple cloth wrapped around the lower half of her face since the fire that claimed her childhood home and scarred her cheek, a faint, mottled tracing that made some recoil, and others simply turn away. It wasn't a secret, but it was a barrier she instinctively kept, a compromise between politeness and fear. But here, in this remote solitude, she had let it drop, allowed the chilling air to kiss the rough texture of her skin, knowing no one was there to witness. The only eyes were those of the forest, indifferent to human imperfections. Her own reflection in the murky depths of a pail of water, distorted, showed a gaunt face, eyes too large, haunted by starvation and grief. Yet, a flicker of stubborn defiance burned within them. She would not die here, not like this. The sound of splintering wood, followed by a heavy thud, tore through the silence, vibrating through the cabin floor. Alara froze, a half-eaten crust of bread falling from her trembling fingers. It wasn't the wind. It was too sharp, too deliberate. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird desperate to escape. She grabbed the rusted iron poker from beside the hearth, its weight unfamiliar, clumsy in her hand. The latch on the door groaned, and then, slowly, agonizingly, the heavy timber swung inward, letting in a gust of icy air and a swirl of snow. Framed against the blizzard, a man stood. He was tall, broad-shouldered, his silhouette ragged against the swirling white. A wolfskin hood obscured most of his face, but a pair of piercing, ice-blue eyes fixed on her. They held a feral glint, the look of a creature accustomed to the wild. He swayed slightly, one hand pressed to his side, a dark stain blossoming on the thick fur of his coat. Blood. He was wounded. Her terror warred with a primal instinct to flee, but she was trapped, cornered in her own hovel. He took a single, shuffling step inside, and the cold air carried the scent of pine, wood smoke, and something else raw, metallic. He didn't speak, simply watched her, those unsettling blue eyes taking in her disheveled state, the poker clutched in her hand. Alara felt utterly exposed, her scar, unhidden, surely visible to him even in the dim light. She expected a flinch, a look of disgust, the familiar turning away. But there was nothing, only a steady, unervingly calm gaze that seemed to pierce through her fear and directly into her soul. He stumbled again, a low grunt escaping his lips, and then pitched forward, collapsing in a heap just inside the doorway, the snow swirling in behind him, slowly burying his form. Alara stared, poker still clutched in hand, unsure whether to be more afraid of the unconscious man or the renewed silence that filled the cabin. He was an unknown, a raw, dangerous presence deposited on her doorstep. Yet, he was also human, bleeding, and the sight of his vulnerability, strangely, quieted the frantic bird in her chest. For the first time in weeks, she was not utterly alone. The stranger, Silas, as she later gleaned from a faded, blood-stained letter in his pocket, remained unconscious for a full day and a night. Alara, driven by a flicker of reluctant empathy and the stark knowledge that she, too, could one day lie helpless in the snow, tended to his wound. A bullet, thankfully, had passed clean through his shoulder, leaving a ragged but not life-threatening hole. She cleaned it as best she could with snowmelt and boiled rags, binding it tightly. He stirred once, his blue eyes fluttering open, observing her with a detached intensity that made her skin prickle, before drifting back into a deep, feverish sleep. She noticed the lines etched around his eyes, the roughness of his hands, the silent strength in his stillness. When he finally woke, fully, his movements were slow, deliberate. He pushed himself up onto an elbow, his gaze sweeping the small cabin, taking in the sparse furnishings, the dying fire, and finally Elara herself, who sat by the hearth, meticulously mending a torn blanket. He said nothing, not a word of thanks, not a question about where he was, just that quiet, assessing gaze. His silence was unnerving, yet it lacked the judgment she had come to expect from people. It was simply observation. Days bled into a monotonous rhythm. Silas, still recovering, moved with a quiet efficiency that surprised her. He sharpened her dull axe, chopped wood with an effortless grace, and set snares in the snow-laden forest, bringing back a lean rabbit or a brace of ptarmigan. He never spoke unless absolutely necessary, and then, his voice was a low rasp, rough-edged like granite. Water, fire, food, each word seemed weighed, precious. Elara, too, found her voice growing quieter, her own thoughts often left unspoken. They communicated through gestures, shared glances, the unspoken understanding of two solitary beings forced into an uneasy alliance against the harsh elements. She had taken to wearing the thin linen scarf around her lower face once more, a habit she couldn't quite break, even when she knew she was alone with him. It was a comfort, a shield. But one evening, while stirring a meager stew, her hand, numb from the cold, slipped. The scarf caught on the rough edge of the cast-iron pot, pulling free. It dropped to the floor, revealing the faint, puckered scar that traversed her jawline and cheek. Elara froze, her breath catching in her throat, her eyes darting to Silas. He was seated on a low stool by the fire, whittling a piece of wood into an unrecognizable shape. His movements didn't falter. His gaze, when it lifted, met hers directly. He saw it. She knew he did. She braced herself for the subtle shift, the slight recoil, the flicker of pity that always preceded the coldness. But his expression remained unchanged. No disgust, no pity, only that same quiet, unervingly steady gaze. For a long moment, time seemed to stretch, held suspended in the warm glow of the fire. Then he simply nodded, a slight, almost imperceptible dip of his head, and returned to his whittling. It was not acceptance, not yet, not in the way she craved. But it was not rejection. It was a lack of reaction, a profound absence of the very judgment that had haunted her for years. In that simple, unburdened glance, Elara felt a subtle crack in the shell she had built around herself. The words, "If you take off the mask, we won't look at you," still echoed. But now, a new sound began to filter through the quiet, persistent hum of a presence that had looked and had not turned away. The precarious peace within the cabin shattered with the sound of distant shouts. Not the wind, not animals, but the coarse, braying calls of men. Silas, who had been cleaning his rifle by the fire, stiffened, his head cocked, listening. Elara felt a familiar dread coil in her stomach. Townspeople, or worse, the desperate drifters who sometimes roamed these parts, scavenging for anything of value. They had heard whispers, no doubt, of Thomas's passing, of a lone woman left vulnerable in the wilderness. Silas moved with a sudden, silent efficiency, pulling a heavy axe from beneath his furs. His ice-blue eyes, usually so impassive, now held a dangerous glint. He motioned towards the back of the cabin, where a small, barely visible trapdoor led to a shallow root cellar. His voice was a low growl, rougher than usual. Elara hesitated. Her instincts screamed at her to obey, to disappear into the earth, but something held her back. The cabin was her sanctuary, the last piece of Thomas she had left. She wouldn't abandon it, not now. Not when she had found a fragile sense of belonging, even with this silent stranger. She shook her head.
No.
Silas's gaze narrowed, a flicker of something akin to frustration crossing his face, but he didn't argue. He simply pointed to the sturdy oak table in the center of the room. Underneath, stay low, he moved to the single window, peering out cautiously, his rifle now cradled in his arm. The shouts grew louder, closer. Then, a pounding on the door, heavy, insistent. "Open up. We know you're in there, woman," a gruff voice bellowed. Alara's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird. She slid under the table, gripping the poker she had kept close since Silas's arrival. The air grew thick with tension, heavy and suffocating. The door burst open with a crash, splintering wood flying inward. 3 men, bundled in furs, their faces crude and predatory, stormed into the cabin. They stopped short, their eyes scanning the dim interior, then falling on Silas, standing defiantly by the window. One, a brutish man with a missing tooth and a cruel smirk, raised his own rifle. Well, looks like the little widow found herself a guard dog. "Thomas ain't here to protect you now, boy," he spat on the floor. Silas remained silent, his rifle steady, aimed at the man's chest. "Leave," he stated, his voice devoid of emotion, yet carrying an immense, chilling weight. The men scoffed, exchanging nervous glances. "We heard Thomas left a good store of furs, and a pretty penny stashed away." Another sneered, eyeing the cabin greedily. "And this land ain't doing anyone any good with a woman and her pet keeping it." A quick, violent exchange followed. The first man lunged forward, but Silas was quicker. He brought the butt of his rifle down in a swift arc, a sickening crack echoing through the room as the man crumpled. The other 2 reacted, but Silas moved like a phantom, a blur of motion and raw power. He was a force of nature, primal and unyielding. Alara, peering from under the table, watched in a horrified fascination. He wasn't just defending himself, he was defending her. His every move was precise, lethal. He was the wolf they mistook for a stray dog. One man, seeing his companions fall, turned to flee, but Silas grabbed him by the scruff of the neck, throwing him against the wall with brutal force. The man's head hit the logs with a dull thud, and he slid to the floor, unconscious. The air was thick with the smell of sweat, fear, and something else, the raw, primal scent of a man pushed to his limits. Silas stood over the unconscious forms, his chest heaving, his eyes still holding that dangerous glint. He looked to the splintered door, then back at Alara, still crouched under the table, her knuckles white around the poker. His gaze softened, just imperceptibly. He had seen her, fully, without the mask, and he had chosen to fight for her. In that moment, the haunting words of the town faded, replaced by the deafening silence of profound, unspoken loyalty. The immediate aftermath was quiet, punctuated only by Silas's steady, rhythmic breathing and the soft hiss of the fire. The 3 men lay sprawled, unconscious but alive, bound tightly with ropes salvaged from the shed. Silas had dragged them to the lean-to outside, a warning for anyone else foolish enough to seek to dispossess them. He had returned, his face grim, and silently set about patching the splintered door as best he could, wedging a heavy log against it for added security. Alara had emerged from under the table, her legs shaky, her hands still trembling. She watched him, seeing not just the capable, stoic man, but the wild, protective creature who had fought for her. The scars on her face, usually a source of her deep-seated insecurity, felt strangely inconsequential now. In the chaos, in the violence he had seen beyond them, had fought for her very right to exist. The words, "If you take off the mask, we won't look at you," finally crumbled, turning to dust in the harsh reality of their shared survival. It wasn't pity or revulsion she saw in Silas's eyes, but a quiet, fierce understanding. That night, the wind howled outside, a lullaby compared to the terror of the past hours. They sat by the fire, the only light in the cabin, its warmth a tangible comfort against the deep cold that tried to reclaim the world. Silas, his shoulder wound throbbing, stared into the dancing flames. Alara watched him, a profound shift occurring within her. She reached up, slowly, deliberately, and untied the linen scarf from her face. It fell to her lap, a silent gesture of surrender and trust. The firelight flickered across her features, illuminating the pale, mottled scar that traversed her jaw and cheek. She kept her gaze steady, meeting his. This was it, her unmasked self, fully revealed. She waited for any sign of repulsion, any subtle flinch, but there was none. Silas's eyes, those unsettling blue depths, met hers. He didn't stare at the scar. He looked at her, at the fear, the resilience, the quiet strength that had carried her through unbearable loss. A flicker of something passed between them, something deeper than words, an acknowledgement of shared hardship and an unspoken bond forged in fire and snow. He reached out, slowly, his large, calloused hand extending towards her. Alara did not flinch. His fingers, rough but gentle, lightly touched her cheek, tracing the line of her scar, not as a blemish, but as a testament to her survival. His thumb brushed over her skin, a gesture of profound acceptance that bypassed all logic, all societal conditioning. He withdrew his hand, then, and his gaze shifted, settling on the fire once more. "You're strong, Alara," he said. His voice a low rumble, the most words he had ever strung together for her. It wasn't a compliment, but a statement of fact, devoid of any sentimentality, yet resonating with deep respect. Tears, hot and unexpected, pricked at Alara's eyes. Not tears of sorrow, but of release. For years, she had believed her face was a mark of shame, a reason for others to turn away. But Silas, the quiet, solitary wolf, had seen past the physical, past the fear, and recognized the strength beneath. He had not looked away. He had looked at her, truly seen her, and in doing so he had changed her forever. The world outside remained a formidable, unforgiving place. The winter would continue its relentless assault, and other threats might yet emerge from the snowy wilderness. But Alara was no longer alone. She had faced her deepest fear, not of dying, but of being unseen, unvalued. And in the silent depths of the wilderness, through shared struggle and unspoken understanding, she had found her dignity, her strength, and an unexpected, quiet partnership. Silas, the solitary man who witnessed her unmasking, had not looked away. He had truly seen, and in that seeing, both their paths had been irrevocably altered, leading them not to an end, but to a new, resilient beginning.